Welcome back to My BrainWise Coach. We're on with another episode today on all things how do we decode our life from a neuroscience perspective. I'm Cole Bastian, one of your hosts for the show today, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil Dixon, and we are so excited to be back with you. Today, we're talking about, really, it's part two. Last week, Phil, we started talking about trust and what does trust look like, because you had an experience where your trust had been broken. And so we went through a little bit of what that meant and then talked a lot about the trust equation and went through the three things on the top, which I believe were, and help me remember, but it was reliability, credibility, and vulnerability. Yeah. And then on the bottom was it's not self-importance, but I can't remember what it was.
Self-orientation.
Self-orientation, yes. So the top three are divided by the bottom. So we went through that and had a conversation around, from a neuroscience perspective, really understanding trust and why it's so important. And we promised that we'd come back today and talk about when trust is broken, how do you go on the process of rebuilding it if it's your desire to rebuild it? So before we dive into that context, because I know we've got a lot of great things to share, how have you been since we last chatted?
As our BrainWise listeners know, we are 98.6% through. I don't know why that number came off the top of my head. But yeah, the kitchen we had our first weekend where we were actually cooking in the kitchen. Oh my gosh, what a pleasant experience it's been. So we are there. And this morning, they actually put the glass in the glass doors. So novel concept, actually have glass in glass doors. So yeah, it's good. Did a lot of work on business planning, on some of the other stuff that we're working on.
Yeah.
Busy, good week.
Wonderful. And I've had a fabulous week as well. I actually spent some time going through. I got all the quotes for my book approved on Friday, which was excellent. And so I went through and just made a couple of updates to them. And now I'm in the process of deciding, do I go ahead and self-publish the book first and then submit for publishing so that it's out in the general population as early as possible and I can begin that discussion? Or do I just wait and go the traditional route? And because it just takes so much longer to do that. And then this weekend, we went to see my favorite artist of all time, which is Chris Brown. And we had such a good time. We went over to Birmingham, Alabama, which is about 3 hours from where we live. And we had a really nice time. I'm not going to be a promoter of any individual person, but I personally really enjoyed his concert, enjoy his music. Outside of the cuss words, I could certainly live without those probably. However, it was good nonetheless, really enjoyed the time, and he's such a great performer. So it was great to get away and disconnect with my husband and just spend time, the two of us and our two little fur babies that went along for the ride. And Birmingham has quite the scene. I didn't realize from a music perspective or just overall the theater and the arts industry. We were watching the screen go and they have something going on like every weekend for the next several months. So just really cool to see. We had a really good time. And then, of course, back at it, working this week on helping with all things transition for work, of course, still doing that for the organization that I'm with, and then focusing on what comes next. So before we dive in, Phil, let's talk about our brain wise or our brain unwise moments from the week.
Yeah, sure. We had a small neighborhood get together on Saturday afternoon. We have new neighbors next door. So it was a little get together to welcome our new neighbors and introduce each other. And let me just put it this way. One of the neighbors started to get a little hot around the collar and introduced a politically difficult conversation. So my BrainWise moment was to not engage and basically say, look, I've got to go home and feed the dogs. And sometimes there's an old phrase in England, discretion is the better part of valor. So I chose discretion.
You're protecting your peace is what I would call it too.
Absolutely. And I love my peas. Oh, peace. Sorry.
Yeah. I love peas too, but in this case, we're talking about peace. It's great to recognize that because some people probably would dive in and start getting all frustrated and upset. And it's just not necessarily worth it, especially depending on who you're talking to. These days, it can be difficult to have what I would describe as a respectful disagreement around something. It seems to get pretty incensed these days, unfortunately. So good for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people tend to argue at an inferential level. He did this, therefore he's a this, opposed to let's actually go back down and look at what the event or the data actually
Right.
said, and then look at how we differently interpret it. But
Yeah.
it requires two to tango on that one, and it also requires no alcohol.
100%. Oh, that lovely beast can certainly add, it can add fuel to the fire for sure, and not always in the best of ways, depending on the circumstances or the
Right.
conversation topic. My prayer continues to be that we get to a place one day where we can all have really good conversations, even when we disagree politically, agree to disagree and continue to move forward. But it just is, it takes time to get there in
Yes.
relationships. My BrainWise moment for the week is we went to see Chris Brown this past weekend, as I shared, and we had a fabulous time. We decided to stay overnight. So we had booked a hotel in advance, and I will, to save the brand name, because I truly do enjoy staying there. We booked a hotel with points and checked in online long before we got there, selected the room that we wanted, said we'd be there around 4. So we arrive to the hotel, and I've traveled for work for a number of years. And so I've been in hotels a lot over the past decade. And so I went in the first time I'd ever experienced this. They said, "What's your name?" And they put my name down on a sticky note. And I noticed they had like 4 sticky notes in a row. And they said, "Okay, go ahead and wait in the lobby." And I looked in the lobby, and there was like 25 people waiting, which is not familiar, is not normal for this particular hotel chain because they don't have a bar and restaurant there. It's more family oriented. So you typically don't see that because people check in and they go straight to their rooms. They're not congregating in a communal area. So I was like, that's strange. I said, I've already checked in online, and she goes, "It's first come, first serve." And so all these people are waiting for a hotel room. And I had said, I'd already checked in. I'd already selected the room, told them what time I was going to be there. We were there past check-in time. And she said, "But you're not going to be able to get the room that she selected. It's going to be first come, first serve." And I could feel myself starting to get very frustrated because I don't like in those moments when service standards don't meet what they should meet. And especially at this particular hotel, it's not like it's a nice hotel, but it's also not a 5-star. We've got big conferences and stuff like that. It's very much family oriented. And so instead of getting frustrated, we left and we drove to a different hotel, got a room, and then called and got our points refunded because I wanted to protect the experience that we were going to have while we were there to see Chris Brown and not let this experience of sitting in the lobby, getting more and more frustrated and angry and just all the things because we had to sit there and wait. We have our dogs with us. What are they supposed to do? We just decided, you know what, we're going to leave so we could protect the peace. In this case, we both had a protect the peace moment. And then it led to beautiful outcome, which is we had a wonderful time. I highly encourage our BrainWise friends, when you're in a space where sometimes you feel like you may be getting a little frustrated or upset, or there could be some disgruntledness happening, is there an opportunity for you to protect your peace and just walk away? Walking away can be a really good positive thing because it's not that you're agreeing with what's happening. It's you're saying my peace and what my experience is more important than getting frustrated in the moment.
It's interesting to look at. Both of us had different experiences, but the parallel was getting frustrated, but just walking away rather than engaging.
Amen.
Sometimes it's the best thing to do. And I think we all have enough stress in our lives at the moment, so those we can actually have control over, then let's reduce the stress.
Let's do it. Absolutely. I'm a huge fan protecting our peace and doing things in small doses too, if you have to, depending on what you're able to handle in that time frame. Let's dive in, Phil. So we talked last week about trust, and we went through the trust equation, credibility, reliability, vulnerability on the top of the division line, and then below in the denominator, I think, numerators on the top, denominators on the bottom, if for all of our mathematicians out there.
Good job.
I know, it was like in my mind, I hope I'm getting this right here. And on the bottom is self-orientation. And so let's just do a quick recap, Phil, maybe in 3 minutes or less. Can you just help us understand the top 3? And then we'll talk a little bit about the bottom before we go into, now that we know trust has been broken, or we think it has been, how do we rebuild it? But let's just recenter ourselves on the trust equation for those who maybe are just tuning in today. Tell us, what is credibility, reliability, and vulnerability? Give us a 60-second or more per one elevator.
And I'm going to see if I can do it in 1 minute.
Perfect.
And that is, credibility is, do you know what you're talking about? Do you know the space that you're in? Do you have experience? If you're a manager, do you have experience as a manager? So do you have do you have the knowledge base? The second part is that, so that was credibility. Reliability is really, do you say what you're going to do? Do what you say, what you do, that type of thing. Do you show up on time? Do you play favorites, or you should not be playing favorites? If you cannot do something, are you upfront and admit that, nope, that's beyond my abilities? So that's the second one, is all about reliability. The third part is about, you said it's vulnerability. I call it openness. It's transparency. The actual words they use is intimacy. I think that's probably okay in the social space, probably not okay in the business space. And that's all about, did you tell enough about your own experience, where your value set lies? Do you act in accordance to your value set? Are you ethical in everything you do? Those type of things. And in my version of the equation, I multiply them together, which, since you took us down the algebra track, if any of those components is small, or heaven forbid, zero, then the whole product, which is the multiplication of one against the other, the whole top line becomes zero or very small. So that's why that's important. So the below the line is the self-orientation. And what that's about is how much of the conversations you have turn back towards yourself. So, for example, do you use I statements versus we statements? Do you go back to a level of listening which is all about how do I reply rather than how do I truly listen? And all of those at the bottom, the more you have of those, the greater that number. And therefore, when you divide it into the above the line, your overall quotient goes down.
And I think when we talk about this from a personal perspective, it applies in the personal or interpersonal relationships as well. It just looks a little bit different. Like, for example, credibility could be you're in a brand new relationship. And so it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in the relationship, but are you demonstrating interest in learning and growing, right, in the relationship and in your ability to gain credibility? Reliability is fairly self-explanatory. Do you do what you say you're going to do on a consistent basis? We talked about consistency. And then I think one that probably from a relational context is most important on the top line is vulnerability. Are you able to demonstrate and share how you actually feel about certain situations? So because doing that, being vulnerable allows for a greater sense of connectivity. And then, of course, self-orientation on the bottom, it applies in the same fashion. So I think that's a very good summation of what is the trust equation, the three components on the top, and then, of course, the denominator on the bottom. Now let's get kicked off into our rebuilding of trust conversation. But before we dive straight into what could be somewhat of some steps people can take to rebuild trust, let's talk a little bit about, Phil, how do we know trust has actually been broken? Because there's probably a sense of something, or maybe we don't have a sense, but I think typically people have a bit of intuition around it. But what are some BrainWise tips that we can give our BrainWise friends on how to know if trust has been broken?
First of all, you may not, because when trust is broken, there's all sorts of other things get broken along with it, one of which might be the willingness to engage or empathy from the other person. There's a whole bunch of other things that are concomitant. There's a whole bunch of other words, descriptions and things that come along with the broken trust. So the first thing is you may not know. The next thing to do is check, ask. That's the best way of finding out. There are ways of asking. I think the important thing is, who had the responsibility for the event that caused the lack of trust? If it was you, BrainWise listener, then it's your responsibility, if you choose to actually then do something about it. If the lack of trust failed because of something somebody else did, you also then have a responsibility to go, wait a minute, if I want to repair this in some way, even though it was something they did, then it's your responsibility to actually go and redress the situation. So that's the first thing. One of the things can be a little bit about, It's the what doesn't happen as opposed to what used to happen. You may not get called so frequently. You may not have as deeper conversations. You may not have, when you walk away from a conversation, you go, that was great. You may not be walking away from conversations and there was just something missing. There's the conscious brain, which is thinking about what's going on. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff going on at the non-conscious level. And so at the non-conscious level, you're probably picking up things like someone not making as much eye contact, someone distracted in the conversation or disengaged. There's a thing in the body language movement called leaking behavior. And that is when you start turning your body away from the conversation, or you open up and as though you're going to move away, or as though you look down. It's called leaking behavior. And we detect that at a non-conscious level.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think from a perspective of personal relationships, we call that turning away from the discussion or turning towards one another. I think that some of that can show up for a variety of reasons, but definitely when it comes to trust and our desire or our feeling of safety in our relationship are we turning towards the discussion? And what we also talk about in that context is not having purposeful distractions in place. It's not just the physical part of the body turning or the conversation turning inward, but then it's also, are we picking up our phones and looking at our phones and having distractions there, or turning on the television or turning on music? Because all of those things serve as a distraction from what the actual conversation is supposed to be about. So those can be some signs that maybe something is broken in the trust relationship. And the other thing is, if you think about the equation, it doesn't mean the trust is always broken entirely. There are some pretty severe events in life that can happen that can cause it to be completely broken, but it also could be that it's just really low. Your ability to trust this particular person or them to trust you. And in those moments, then now, how do we begin to build out of that? Which one of the things I was going to ask you about, Phil, is what's happening in the moment, or what's happening in the brain the moment trust is broken. So maybe not that exact moment, but what's happening for us when we know trust is broken with this particular person?
When we actually experience that break in trust, and sometimes it can be instantaneous, sometimes it's a thought process that leads to a sense of broken trust. Let's take a look at the instantaneous one, then we go back to the amygdala and all the conversations we had about what goes on in the amygdala triggers off a whole variety of things, cortisol, and cortisol enhances the amygdala and therefore begins a sense of looking for confirming behavior. And we will go down that track of ruminating over what has happened and reinterpreting some of the things that have happened in the past in light of that change, whether we're correctly reinterpreting them or not. I'm not going down that track. We tend to go back and go, oh, that's why he or she said this 3 weeks ago. May have nothing to do with it. So we tend to ruminate over those type of things. Again, I think that we talked about the fact that when we feel a threat like that, it triggers off the same circuitry as the actual circuitry that we experience when we have pain. And so when we say the lack of trust or the loss of trust hurts, it doesn't physically hurt, but it's stimulating the same brain circuitry as an actual pain.
Wow.
That causes a couple of things to happen. One is because the amygdala is now flaring up, that's in the limbic system. The limbic system is responsible for emotional content. So now we'll become emotional. And when an event occurs, it is laid down in our memory exactly the same time as the memory of the event itself. So we hook that emotion with the event. And the hippocampus actually takes care of that for us. That's why emotional events are easy to recall. Very difficult to recall the physical pain, but the emotional pain is relatively easy.
Wow.
So those are all going on in split second.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because it also leads to betrayal can sometimes linger on for a pretty long period of time. And I think based on what you're just describing is that It's trust isn't a switch necessarily, like we talked about with the trust equation. It's not like it just maybe to some degree could go instantly to zero depending on how things are happening. But it's oftentimes it's a system. There's different things, and we also, I think one of the other things is our definition of what could break my trust versus what could break your trust could be somewhat different because we have different value systems, different ethics, whatever it might be. And betrayal as a feeling can linger on for a period of time because you have so many memories connected to people. The emotional part is hard to completely let go. People say, I might forget what you've done to me, but I'll never forget how you've made me feel. That saying, it rings really true, and it connects to the feeling of betrayal. And so I think, Phil, if we think about it from a neuroscience perspective, now that we know or we've confirmed for ourselves that trust is broken, either from our standpoint with another person or from their standpoint with us, what are some of the first signals that repair is possible? Knowing that we want to help provide some tips on how can we rebuild trust, what are some of the first signals that we know trust is even, or repair is even possible?
In many ways, it's the opposite of what we started the conversation with. How do you know that trust is broken? It's things like body language and eye movement and nodding of your head when we're in agreement and all those subtle cues. Picking back up on those that the other person gives off signals that, yes, that's sometimes and this is going to sound strange, but sometimes just going up to somebody and saying, I need a hug, or I'm going to give you a hug. Hug actually releases oxytocin. And when we get to oxytocin, we're much more likely to have empathy and all those other things that are going on. Lots and lots of chemicals around. And so those are the sort of clues that you can get. Right. Again, if you have the courage, and not everyone would have the courage to do, but actually suggesting the conversation that says, hey, look like things went awry for us. Are you willing to re-engage and talk about what went wrong and what we can do in the future?
And I think in marriage or in spousal or committed relationships, that context, it can, depending on what's happened to break trust and that there's a desire to rebuild it, there may be some intentionality that has to happen too, right? Asking the question, are we able to begin this process? And of course, I always recommend marital counseling in that instance, or relational counseling, because they can help guide you. But I think once you've established that you are willing to rebuild trust, then, and this is a high level summary, and then we'll talk about some of these points as we move along the next several set of discussion items. But I do want to frame up 8 key, I don't know if I'd call them factors or characteristics or components of rebuilding trust, which is understanding the impact of the lie or what actually broke the trust. What does that impact actually mean? Then 2, what is the importance of accountability in rebuilding trust, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. Opening up to transparent communication, because that becomes really important. We talked about that from a vulnerability perspective in the trust equation. Building reassurance through actions, not just words, reliability in the trust equation. Giving time and space for healing, which I think is an interesting one, because a lot of times what I hear from people is we were on the rebuilding of trust process, but then they got upset about what the same similar event or the same event in the future. Not that something else had happened, but it's just that there was something that was triggered that triggered them to get upset again. And so how do we give space and time for people to heal versus forcing them to heal as fast as possible? Because that actually has the opposite impact or opposite effect of what we're trying to accomplish. Working together towards growth, reconnecting emotionally and rebuilding intimacy, and then finally choosing to forgive when you're ready. And so I think those things we're going to cover as we go along these next several set of discussion points. And then you can also use some of that from a professional context. But it requires a high degree of an intentionality in the rebuilding of trust process, because it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen by happenstance. Time does not always heal it, because there are things that have to happen in order for the brain to be able to move forward in that discussion. So with that, Phil, knowing that accountability is a big part of trust and rebuilding it, how can leaders or partners show accountability in a way that helps the brain begin to trust again?
So the first thing is, and again, so I'm going to come from the point of view that it was me that violated the trust. Very first thing is apology. And I think we've talked a little bit about a guy called Randy Pausch. Listeners, BrainWise listeners who are not experienced with Randy Pausch, he was, and I think this is probably 10 years ago now, I can't remember exactly, but he was diagnosed with, I think, duodenal cancer or gastrointestinal cancer of some sort. And basically, he knew that he'd only got 2 or 3 months to live. So he was a lecturer at the university, and he chose the specific time when he gave his last lecture. And it was like, it wasn't a lecture about his topic, it was a lecture about life. And it's a pretty powerful lecture. During that lecture, he talks about the need, we all need to learn how to apologize. And he does it so well because he said, when you're in the process of making an apology, only an A will do. Nothing else will suffice.
Right.
And so he was putting it in that terminology. And he gives some examples about saying, I'm sorry, but the reason why it happened, or I'm sorry, however.
Fancy
or,
butts, as we call them.
Yeah.
Butts and tuxedos, Phil.
The butts in tuxedos. That's exactly right. So none of that. Basically, it's what I did, and he divides it into 3. What I did was wrong. I feel bad that I hurt you. What can I do to improve or make it better or whatever has to happen next? And so those are 3 fairly easy ones to remember. And that's very often the first thing to do is, and it's in some ways, it's what you said just now, it's taking accountability. Taking accountability for that first step and apologizing.
Yeah. And it comes, once you've apologized, I think a lot of people think in their minds, which I want to talk about intent versus impact here in a moment, but a lot of people think when I've apologized for something, now we should be able to move on. I've been accountable for it. We have to move forward. We need to rewind a little bit and say, okay, you've taken the first step of accountability and you've admitted that either you did something wrong or something that you did had a negative impact that you didn't want it to have, or you didn't intend for it to have. And now you know what you're going to do differently moving forward. But accountability can also look like, especially if you're rebuilding trust, being very transparent and open and honest about everything. Especially, I think about infidelity for relationships becomes a common one in marriage or in spousal relationships is there's going to be some things that you're going to have to do very differently moving forward. Your behavior pre-apology cannot look the same post-apology, because if that's the case, then you really didn't take accountability. You said you were sorry, but then did you actually really mean it? Your actions have to look different. And does it mean that you're going to get it perfect right away? No. But you also have to be vulnerable enough and open enough to know that you're going to need to adjust as you go and be open to people's feedback along the journey. And even at work, if you think about it from a work perspective, you've broken someone's trust or whatever it is, you are going to have to do something different, because otherwise you've not actually taken accountability. Accountability isn't the act of apologizing. Apologizing is the first step to being able to begin the repair process. And then the actions that follow become probably just as much, if not more critical. Actions speak louder than words. And as I do things more consistently, it creates safety for the brain from that perspective. You have to start rebuilding that now because you broke it with that individual, with whatever event it was. And so I want to just really quick, before we move forward, is talk about intent versus impact, Phil, because as you're talking about the apology, sometimes what I'll hear from people as they have conversations or they call me is, I didn't intend to do that. I didn't do that on purpose, right? I didn't say this to intentionally hurt that person. It's just what I thought or what I felt. And so what we try to make is a distinction between intent versus the impact. So intention implies I did this action on purpose to hurt you, versus I didn't intend to do it, but the impact was nonetheless just as critical because it had a negative impact on the person, right? So I may have used a phrase of words that were offensive to somebody else. And while I may not have intended it that way, is the impact of what I did any less severe to the other person? No. And I think in that instance, you can still have a really solid apology, right? You're not admitting that. What you're doing is you're admitting that the actions you've had an unintended consequence of hurting someone else. And so now you need to be able to do and adjust moving forward. And there becomes this argument back and forth of I shouldn't have to apologize and all that. At the end of the day, what I always try to remind people is, are we trying to be really great people and great human beings and stewards of the lives we've been gifted with and build relationships with people? Or are we trying to stand on principle for ourselves? And I think that comes back to the self-orientation part we talked about on the trust equation. So I would just really encourage all of our BrainWise friends to think about it from whether it's your perspective that you did something unintentionally that hurt someone else, or that they did that to you. Is it intention or is it impact? And it doesn't mean it's any less severe or that there shouldn't be accountability, but it does change the perspective to some degree. Like I know, for instance, with my spouse, sometimes I will say things that I don't mean in the way that they land. And I still have to be accountable to it because I love my husband and I want to have a great relationship with him and I want to be a better human being. It doesn't mean that I did it on purpose, but it doesn't mean that my actions are any less impactful. So I think that distinction is really important for people as we talk about apologies.
I think that's great. And you mentioned a thing about your behavior post the event can't be the same as it was prior to the event. And so if we delve into the brain, and you look at, I'm going to have to draw a diagram. So anybody who's driving along, you're probably not going to get this. But if we look at cortisol and it starts to creep up, and then it actually goes up high. It's a hockey curve, hockey stick. And we tend to assume that if we remove that pressure or that insult or whatever it was that we did, then that person's going to go down the same curve. Doesn't happen that way. It actually, it's called chaos theory, and it actually continues high and continues very high, and then will gradually drop off. And you've got to remember that's both from a neurophysiology point of view and also from a psychological point of view. We don't go back down the same pathway that got us there. It hangs around for a while. From a neurological point of view, it hangs around for a brief period of time, a couple of hours. But from a psychological point of view, it can hang around for days, weeks, months, years before that then goes down. I want to repeat what you said is forgive and forget. There's a lot of people will forgive, but if it's an emotional event, the brain actually has a difficult time in actually forgetting it happened.
Which I think is an important distinction too. I think forgiving people is different than forgetting. And especially I'll say from a relational perspective, we do have to get to a place where we're able to, I don't know if forget's the right word, but truly move on. Because I think a lot of times, and I'm going to say this and it might be counter to what some people believe, but I think that, and this is just my personal viewpoint on it, is that people will use forgive and forget. Yeah, I can forgive you, but I won't be able to forget as an excuse to not actually forgive someone. And so that's not what we're talking about here. It's that the brain is wired and those emotions will be triggered, right? But then what you choose to do as you move forward becomes equally as important. And so I would encourage our BrainWise friends, when you are forgiving and you're truly going to forgive someone, you're also in some degree going to show up differently yourself, right? Yeah. And so that way, and if something happens and you get triggered, you're not immediately jumping back into screaming, hollering, yelling, or silent treatment or whatever it is, about that situation. You're actually able to go, okay, wait a minute, I'm being triggered. But is it actually happening in today's environment? Is it in my present experience, or is it a trigger from my past? And if it's from the past, then it's your responsibility or our responsibility in that moment to rewire a little bit of what's happening and say, okay, it's actually not happening right now. Give me a moment, whatever the time frame is that you need, and move forward, because it's not the other person's fault that you're being triggered from the past, right? Not your fault either, but it is your responsibility to do something different about it. So I think it's important to have that conversation, because we don't want to ever give anyone excuses for choosing to show up in a way that isn't their best self. And so I think the theme is, don't talk about being ready to forgive someone until you really are. And it's okay. It might take time for you to get to that space.
And what I would say is, when we use the word trigger here, we're not talking about so much the same triggers that cause threat into the brain instantly. And those triggers now can be the same music that was playing, or walking through a door or archway was just where we had the argument before, or seeing a billboard or a neon sign or something. All of those other extraneous things can be triggers as well, which just remind the brain of what actually happened 3 years ago or 5 years ago or last week. different types of triggers we're talking about than the pure threat triggers of what we've been discussing to date.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to suggest there is certainly in the workplace, there's a structure whereby you can actually have the conversation about how to resurrect something. And you can actually do it about any issue. It's called an issue resolution process. And what it's about is you state what the issue is. And so in this case, our issue is diminished level of trust. And then it's sometimes easier to put a scale number on it, right? So on a scale of 1 to 10, my trust level for you is a fill in the blank. This is actually even better if you can actually both agree to actually have this structure in advance, take some time. Let's say it was my trust level for you is 10 out of 10, so I don't think it'd be an issue. But if you and I were having an issue, then we both use this pre-formatted template, if you like. And so the first one is, what's the level of trust that I have? And then the second thing is to name why. So if I say my level of trust for you has gone down to 5 out of 10, and the reason why, then it's what has been the impact of that to me, and it takes back to the impact statement you were talking about earlier on. If you're in an organization, then what has been the impact on the organization? And the next statement is, why is it important to repair it? Because if you don't have agreement on why it's important, you may both have different reasons, but if I don't see your reason as valid, then I'm probably not going to do anything. So then it is, what is my request of you? And then is what I propose to do about it. And then to wrap up, you write up it's a statement that says, and the benefit to you of changing is this, the benefit to me is changing. What's the benefit to me? And then finally, what's the benefit to the organization?
I was just going to say that you mentioned that was probably more for the work context, but I think it also applies in the personal context. Just sub out organization and sub in your relationship with that person. So whether it's your marriage or your friendship or just a relationship you have in general with them, you can have a very similar conversation to kickstart the process of rebuilding trust in that same manner. Just sub out some of the terminology.
Yeah. And if anybody any of our BrainWise listeners, we actually have that template written up. Happy to send it to anybody who might find it useful.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important to agree on the front end that this is the structure we're going to follow, whether it's in the work context and you have a pre-discussion, or it's something that's like an organizational value or commitment. And then in your relationships, making sure that's a part of your ground rules or your rules of engagement is, if trust is broken, we're going to start with this process, right? Or this conversation that allows us to then move into those next steps, which transparency is really important on both sides in that conversation. And that really goes into the area of vulnerability and being able to be vulnerable about what's the impact to me, what's the impact to you, what's the impact to our organization, to our team, to our marriage, to our friendship, and not at a surface level, because I think a lot of times we're good at intuition's the word I would use, but really identifying where we feel that there's a level of authenticity coming in. When you go 1 or 2 layers below the surface to say how it truly made you feel and why it's been so impactful to you, it creates a level of connection with the other person to go, okay, now I see why this has been so impactful for them. Maybe it's not that same event wouldn't have been that impactful for you. That's fine, but that's not what the conversation topic is about. It's you seeing it from their perspective and then you being able to share how it's also impacted you and or the relationship, so on and so forth. And I think then in that same discussion, how it made the impact to you or how it made you feel and the impact to the relationship or to the organization is also on the receiving end, just demonstrating a level of empathy. Because I think empathy is going to be really critical in rebuilding trust. And it's going to be needed past the first initial conversation. And that's what after we talk about empathy, I want to go to next is How long and what does it look like as you go along the journey? Because it can take time to rebuild the relationship or reestablish trust. In your perspective, Phil, or from a neuroscience perspective, why is empathy, or what is the role of empathy in rebuilding trust, and why might it be so important?
So the empathy is important in trust for a number of reasons, but one of the things is that empathy helps to create a feeling of safety. And probably, I would say, most of the things that we're looking for here come under that umbrella of needing to feel safe. And we feel safe by feeling protected. We feel safe by being part of the group. Now that, are you still part of my in group? Are you still going to take care of me? And consistent behavior. Oh, can we get back to some level of consistency? Our brains love consistency. And can we get back to some level where I can predict the way that we're going to engage in our relationship? So I think that I'd like to put that under that whole safety umbrella for the time being, and empathy increases each of those.
Yeah.
I'm going to remind our audience that when we talk about feeling protected, then part of it is feeling that we were treated, or that everyone around us was treated fairly. Because that, if I'm not being treated fairly, that actually, I just remind everybody, that invokes the same circuitry as disgust. If I'm disgusted with you, then it's difficult to get back to a level of trust. Empathy, being empathetic, showing empathy, showing vulnerability. If it was your fault to start with, but even if it was the other person that did it, you allowing that person to come back into your life, and empathy will tend to be a driver towards that.
Exactly. Empathy, or the ability to demonstrate empathy, is not a skill that everyone comes by naturally, especially from, we talked about our worldview or our personal paradigms. There may be things that trigger you in a conversation where someone's talking about something and they're just expressing their feelings, especially in that context we were just discussing with the rebuilding of trust, that conversation structure, especially when people start talking about how it made them feel or the impact it's had on myself or on the organization or on our relationship. A lot of times people are listening to try to fix it, which empathy doesn't require you to fix it. It just requires you to listen. And then two, there are people that some of us have built up worldviews or mental models that we don't want to be seen in a way that is counter to how we see ourselves. It's really important for those individuals who have that personal paradigm or that mental model that I have this kind of belief system of myself, right? And how I want to be seen by others. And when I start to hear things that I, as an individual, feel might be an attack on that belief system, I now need to defend myself to be able to say, no, that's not true. That's not what I meant. That's not how I intend, so on and so forth. But that's where being able to demonstrate empathy, you have to really hold yourself in and say, you know what, that it's not about that. This is about that person expressing where they're coming from and how it made them feel. And when you're demonstrating empathy, it's the simple act of saying, I acknowledge that those events have you feeling that way. It's not acknowledging that you are saying, okay, yeah, that's actually what happened, or that's the intent, or all the things. It's simply giving space for them to feel how they feel and then be able to move forward. And again, we come back to that intent versus impact part in relationships, especially, is that even though they may be going against things that you believe are a part of your character, and how could that ever have happened, or how could they have ever seen me that way, and I need to defend myself, you actually have the opposite impact of what you're trying to accomplish if you do defend yourself, because defensiveness now shows to some degree that you're responsible, or that is actually what you intended to do. And so it has the opposite impact. And so just listening, sitting back and saying, I understand that those events have you feeling this way. Put a big old beautiful period at the end of that sentence, because you don't want to use your transitional words, because then it makes it all about you. And you'll watch this in a conversation with someone when you're trying to demonstrate empathy, or when you're apologizing for something and you don't do it that way, the situation rises and the emotions escalate because you are now making it about you versus truly demonstrating empathy. And so it's extremely important in trust, as you were describing, Phil, to demonstrate empathy so that the other person feels seen, heard, and they feel felt, and then allows them to be able to move forward in the conversation and in the process of rebuilding trust.
So I do want to, this sounds like it's been a very heavy topic today. So I want to give a little bit of reinforcement, but with some lightheartedness, if
I love it.
that's okay for you. And that is many years ago, this is probably 20 years ago, I was in one of those issue resolution conversations. And I won't give the guy's name. We'll call him Bob. And so we decided I would go first. And I said, look, on a scale of 1 to 10, my trust level for you is a 4. And I said, and the reason why is that of all the year or so I've known you, you intimidate me. Because this guy was as smart as a whip, and he seemed to have the answer for everything. And I could see this sort of little smile coming up on each side of his mouth. And he let me finish. And he said, I'm not going to read mine to you. He said, I'm going to show you what I wrote. And he held this up to me. And what he wrote was, my trust level for you is a 4 because you intimidate me. So by having that intense conversation, we both realized that there was a barrier that we're having between us, and the lack of trust was just lack of shoulder time. We called it flying time together. And so we agreed to go out to lunch, find out more about each other. And so it's also, so it's a little lighthearted, but it illustrates the point that sometimes the reason why that trust got eroded in the first place is neither of you did anything explicit. It was just a lack of communication or a lack of time together. Or so there isn't necessarily an event that occurs. But the picture I had of this guy's mind was that he was 196 IQ and I was a mere whatever it might be. And so my mind, we go back to that. We're really good at making stuff up. We both have made pictures up about each other. And that's where the lack of trust came from.
Exactly. And it took a level of vulnerability to be able to have that conversation, and you're able to move forward, which I think from a perspective of ensuring that we look at the positive side of this, because it has been probably a little bit heavier of a conversation. Hopefully there's been some good nuggets for people to take away, whether for ourselves as individuals in rebuilding trust that we may have broken, but things to look for from the perspective of if someone's broken our trust, what are some of the things we can do to begin repairing that conversation if it's of our choosing? We're not suggesting that any of these things anyone has to do. It's just, here's some suggestions or things that you can do. But let's look at the positive side. So can trust actually become even stronger as you go along the rebuilding of trust process? Can it become stronger on the other side, Phil?
So I think that example I just gave, Bob and I are still on LinkedIn together years later. I do know that there was one occasion probably 10 years ago when I needed some help. I phoned him up and he was there immediately. So my experience is that yes, it can be. It's not going to happen back, oh, my level of trust for you is a 9, and therefore tomorrow it's going to be a 9 again because I went through this procedure. As you said, it takes time. But can it be built back up? Yes, absolutely.
It does, exactly. And I often believe that it actually does get even stronger as long as everyone in the situation is willing to do the work to get to that place. In teams, it can be there's more open and honest communication where it leads to more innovation, it leads to more creativity, more strategic thinking, the ability to accomplish the goals in hand, right? In relationships, it can turn the love from an idea into a practice, one built on truth instead of delusion. And I think it's oftentimes rebuilding trust isn't something that we do alone. It's something we do together. And therefore, the act of actually doing it together rebuilds it in a more stronger way. Because a lot of times, I think trust on the front end of a relationship is to some degree inherent in some situations. Maybe it's not real strong at first, but over time, it builds and builds and builds. When it's broken, obviously, it becomes a very difficult process to move forward, but you are able to. But because you're doing it together, you're able to reinforce the relationship in a more intentional way that's going to allow for a stronger overall connection. And so I think that as long as everyone's willing, we're not saying that by any means anyone has to. You can certainly choose to not move forward and sever the relationship if that is what's best for you and best for the situation. But if you've determined that's not the case, there is the possibility of it being an even stronger relationship in the future. You hear about it all the time, especially marriages where there's been infidelity and they stay and they do the work. By no means are we advocating for one way or another, but then they say that their relationship and their trust factor is even stronger on the other side, and it can give you hope if that is something that you want to do, or you can choose to move forward and find a more trusting relationship with someone else. I think the overall sentiment is that while it has been a heavier topic and rebuilding trust can be quite the process, there is some really good, hopeful signs that things can be even better on the other side of it. It might just take some real intentional work to get there.
And talk about, let's drill in on that. What's the intent? Many years ago, I learned to ask a couple of questions of myself. And that is, if I take a certain action, which in this case might be, I'm going to take some action to repair that trust. Ask a couple of questions. First of all is, what's the best that can happen? And jot down 2 or 3 things, right? Then, what's the worst that can happen if I do that? And very often, there's not a lot that's bad that can happen as a result. But if there is a couple of things, I'm going to take an action. I'm going to have that conversation with Bob. What's the worst that can happen? He punches me on the nose. That's unlikely to happen, but it makes the matter worse, etc. You go down 3 or 4 of those. And then for each of those items, ask the following question. What could I do to prevent that from occurring? What would I do if I observed it in the moment? And what could I do to recover from it? So now when you've done all of that, you've actually, by answering the question, what's the best that can happen? And the reverse of the worst that can happen, you've actually set the goals up for your conversation.
Right. Which is awesome. And it allows, especially if you've determined that is the direction you're going to move in. It might also, especially personal relationships, it might help you determine that maybe now is not the time to have that conversation, which is okay too. Or that you're not going to have that conversation at all and you're going to part ways, which is okay in your context too. But it gives you a more logical approach to being able to determine the outcome of or what you should do as your next steps, which I think is a great way to frame it up.
And absolutely. And doing that, it's a more formal, analytical, what some people might call a left brain approach to it. And it doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody's going to want to do it that way. But it does give you a template for how to think through. And also, as you said, if what's going to happen as you go through, you'll start to see some patterns, some things that you go, wait a minute. No, if that thing there happens, I can't live with that. And so it helps you focus on what are the areas that you've got to do to actually prevent that from occurring.
Phil, as we wrap up our conversation on rebuilding trust from a neuroscience perspective, how would you like to summarize it for our BrainWise friends before we go into a few of our reflection questions?
I think the summary is that trust it takes a long while. You've heard this old adage before. It takes a long while to build up and then can go down in seconds. I think one of the things we haven't talked about yet is when you start off with somebody and you've got over the initial engagement with them, and so you're now starting to work. A good partner of mine once said, you have to make a decision. Is your trust bucket full or is your trust bucket empty? And it's a lovely metaphor. And he said, a more enjoyable, positive way of life is to assume that the trust bucket is full to start with. Now, it's like the old milk pails. When you walk along, you're going to slop some of it out and you're going to lose some of it en route. But what do you do to keep that trust bucket full all the time? It's a maintenance process. We're all so busy these days that we can forget to call somebody that we used to call on a more regular basis. Now, has that caused the trust bucket to lose some of its liquid? So I find it a useful metaphor to have in my head. Where is my trust bucket? Is it full? Is it half empty? Is it laying on its side, letting all the water or milk flow out?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great analogy, a great metaphor, because it does give a good context for the trust equation, right? The higher the trust equation number, the higher the bucket, or the fuller the bucket is, right? The lower it is, the more empty it is. And of
Right.
course, the higher it can be, the better the relationship's going to be. So how can we intentionally on the front end go into relationships and consistently demonstrate actions and keep our word or be reliable, essentially, so that way the bucket can always stay full? Because it is such a better feeling to have a trustful relationship than one that is mired with untrust.
Yep. So that's the trust bucket metaphor is my sort of summary of the last two discussions we've had.
I love it. Here's a couple of reflection questions for our BrainWise friends. And of course, we're not asking that you choose all of them, but choose one or two that most resonate with you based off the conversation today. The first one is, whose trust have I broken? And what would rebuilding it look like if I focused on consistency, not apology? Or the inverse, whose trust has been broken with me? And what would rebuilding it look like? Where in life do I still flinch from past hurt? And what signal of safety could help me move forward? How do I communicate trustworthiness through tone, honesty, or follow through, both at work and at home? What's one promise I can keep this week that strengthens credibility? And where do I need to rebuild trust with myself before expecting it from others? So that's our episode. We have had the last two conversations that we have had. The first one was around what is trust from a neuroscience perspective. Now it's the neuroscience of rebuilding trust, both professionally and personally. And so hopefully you've gotten some really good nuggets or really good BrainWise tips that you can use to begin rebuilding trust or rethinking, what does trust look like? And is your trust bucket full? Is it 3/4 full? Is it half empty? Is it a quarter full? Or 3/4 empty? Whichever way it is that you choose to look at the bucket being full, but where is it? And then how can you begin to improve it or to fill it back up, whether from your perspective or from initiating conversation, so that from their perspective, they can begin to rebuild it. And as always, if you enjoyed our episode today, comment, share, subscribe to our episode. We're on wherever you get your podcasts. And most importantly, share this with your friends and family and your coworkers so that they too can begin to decode their life through a BrainWise perspective. And we'll see you next week. Until then, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay BrainWise.